How do you do, folks? We are back in the messy loft studio for another edition of Indicator Plants of BC. This time, group number 7, we have more berries. We've had so many berries in this course, and we've got more. Woohoo! So what do we have this week? We have small little tiny plants with red berries. We have like kind of medium-sized like little shrub leathery plants with blueberries. And then we have the Vacciniums, and we love the Vacciniums because they are always so delicious. But just to start us off, small with red berries. And first plant is the Bunchberry, Cornus canadensis. So we already had one Cornus in this course already. That was our Cornus sericea, or the red osier dogwood. And yeah, the Bunchberry is the other one that we're concerned with. These plants, they look, there's the same genus, but they look completely different. The red osier dogwood is like this big bush. Bunchberry is this really little tiny, is it a shrub or an herb? It's a really tiny little plant that just sits right on the ground and is hardly noticeable. Another name for it is dwarf dogwood. Western dwarf dogwood. And personally, I find that one a little bit easier to remember because, you have the Cornus. Cornus is always associated with those dogwoods. Now, canadensis in the name here. Just a little piece of trivia. This is considered by a lot of folks. This is like Canada's unofficial national flower, and that's based on a poll a few years ago from the Association of Master Gardeners of Ontario. They surveyed 10,000 people across Canada, and the vote was for the bunchberry, for the for the western dwarf dogwood. Yeah, really beautiful little plant. Having a look at those flowers now. So remember, with our dogwoods, they produce a cluster of flowers, an inflorescence, kind of in the middle there. And then really, kind of a really typical look for them is to have these big white bracts. They look like petals, but they're actually a type of modified leaf around the outside. And the bunchberry, the flowers, you'll see this kind of flower, this kind of compound flower pop up a lot. The Pacific dogwood over on the right here, Cornus natalii, that is the provincial flower of British Columbia. And so you see this iconography pop up in lots of places. So this is the sign marking the marine park when you're entering into Desolation Sound on the Sunshine Coast in British Columbia. So you'll get to know this flower really, really well. You see it all over the place in BC. Looking at the little berries now. So it's called a bunchberry. It's got kind of this vertical stalk that produces all those little flowers turn into this tiny cluster of little red berries. Apparently, they're kind of sweet tasting. I've only tried them once or twice. They are kind of sweet. They're not amazing, you're not going to go out of your way to go and collect them. And then underneath here, underneath the berries there, you can get a better look at some of the leaves in this photo as well. Pretty distinctive looking. The dwarf dogwood, the bunchberry, produces this whorl of leaves. So you've got multiple leaves coming out from one point on the plant. And they're really kind of pretty cool looking leaves. The veins, you can look at the veins here. The Pojar and McKinnon book, this guy right here, calls them parallel veins. To me, they look more like kind of a cross between parallel and pinnate. They're kind of coming off like that. But really aesthetic looking, kind of fat, bulbous, almost onion-shaped little leaves there. Okay, next up we have our Kinnickinnick. Arctostaphylos uva-ursi. Ursi in the scientific name there. So that comes from Ursus. I believe the Greek, it's either Latin or Greek for bear. Another name for this is bearberry, and apparently bears love to eat these things. Apparently for you and me though, the berries are edible, but they're kind of tasteless. They don't really taste like much. And another one that you're not really gonna go out of your way to collect. But you find this one in a lot more kind of mountainous environments. The bunchberry that we just looked at, if you're just looking at the berries, they look kind of similar, the two plants. But the bunchberry you find down in sort of lowland forests, and then you find your Kinnickinnick up in more mountainous places. Having a look at a few of those reproductive structures now. So you can see it produces these beautiful little bell-shaped flowers, just a little cluster of tiny pink flowers there. And then you've also got, and those will turn into these red berries once they're fertilized. Yeah, those little berries that the bears love to eat. Apparently they've got some really big seeds on the inside, so they're sort of nasty tasting. And an important way to tell this plant apart from the bunchberry that we just looked at is to look at the leaves, though. So the bunchberry, the leaves they're not massive, but they're getting up to about half the size of the palm of your hand, maybe. On the other hand, the Kinnickinnick, the leaves are really, really small little leaves. They're like the size of your fingertip. They're really quite tiny. And a little bit of trivia, back in the day, these leaves were collected and dried, and they could be smoked as kind of a substitute for tobacco. There you go. Do with that what you will. And this slide is just, so this is just sort of a size comparison for telling these plants apart. If you're only looking at the berries, you might get these confused, but once you look at the flowers, once you look at the leaves, they really do look quite different. Next up, we have some leathery shrubs with blue berries. First of all, our Salal, Gaultheria shallon. Yeah, so Salal, anyone that has gone for a hike in the lower mainland of BC will get to know their Salal well, because this forms these big thickets right alongside trails, and especially if you go to a place like Lighthouse Park, you find the Salal growing right alongside the trails there, and it really forms these big tangles, and sometimes you have to do a little bit of bush bashing to get through your Salal. But this one likes slightly drier to medium soil moisture regimes. So yeah, you find it in those kind of these drier forests. And looking in at a few of these leaves here, so the leaves they're going to range in size from like the palm of your hand to your entire hand. The entire hand would be really on the very big side. They're pointed on the end, but they're really quite a fat oval shape. And then something to know about these leaves is they tend to be really glossy. And so you can kind of see in this photo here how the light is shining off of it. This is a very glossy leaf. They're slightly serrated around the edges. It's not always obvious, but you can see in the right-hand photo, it's got these light serrations. And you hold on to one of these things, it's a really kind of thick, durable, leathery leaf. And so when this becomes useful is, say you're going out for a hike and you don't have your toilet paper, sometimes Salal can be one of the useful plants that you can use in place of that. Looking at some of the reproductive stuff now, first of all, the flowers. So once again, beautiful little bell-shaped flowers. This type of flower is pretty typical of ericaceous plants. A lot of these plants that we're looking at are in the Ericaceae, which is the heaths or the heathers, all the same family. And lots of those produce these bell-shaped flowers here. And so yeah, these beautiful little bell-shaped flowers, and these flowers, you'll have many, many flowers that occur on this single stem that pokes out there. And so you have these big bunches of flowers that appear all together. Now, once those flowers are pollinated, then they'll turn into these really deep purple colored berries. And the berries are edible. They're not bad. Historically, they've been a really important food source for peoples in the Pacific Northwest as well as animals. I'm not a massive fan of them myself. The berry, they're kind of hairy on the outside. They've got like this big seed on the inside, and they're kind of eh. But definitely try them if you're out. Maybe you've got a different opinion than me. Next up, our dull organ grape, Mahonia nervosa. So this plant, from a far distance, it might look superficially similar to the salal that we were just looking at. But the key thing to look at here, and why this one's super distinct, is because it's got all these spines around the edges of the leaves. Not just serrate leaves, but actual honest-to-God little prickles that you could prick yourself on. And so how does that connect up with this scientific name? Well, Mahonia nervosa, you see all those prickles, you might get kind of nervous. Huh? Right? Other than that, you find this one in lots of similar, this one will like a lot of similar sites to Salal. It likes the same soil moisture regimes, soil nutrients. The Salal, is in poorer soils. The dull organ grape needs a little bit more nutrition, so it's got the medium soil nutrient regime. And getting a close look at some of those leaves. Yikes. So you can see all of the little spines around there makes this plant look really, really distinctive. And then one thing to note as well is this plant actually has these compound leaves. So we talked about the compound leaves recently. That's where you notice in the axil, the point where the leaf, this little leaflet attaches to the stem, there's no bud. Because there's no bud, we know that this is a leaflet and not a true leaf by itself. That's just getting real technical and botanical. But you'll notice that all these leaflets, they're arranged oppositely, so that's pretty distinctive. That's a pretty key thing to note if you find opposite leaves or leaflets out in the forest. And then otherwise, other than the spines and the kind of the technical botanical stuff, the leaves in general have a kind of a similar texture to the salal. They tend to be really leathery, quite durable, quite kind of shiny and thick, but I wouldn't want to use one of these for toilet paper if I were you. Looking at some of the reproductive stuff now, so it's got these very distinctive looking, flowers here on the left. So we've looked at a lot of the plants that we look at this week have these little bell-shaped flowers. This one, they're not quite so bell-shaped. You can really see distinctive petals there. Then this kind of really pretty yellow color, they're standing quite erect. A few things to notice there, these erect inflorescences of yellow flowers. Pollinated, those are going to turn into these blue berries. And the berries, I haven't tried them myself. Apparently, you can eat them, but they're not so great. Apparently, folks make wine and jam and things like that out of them, though. So, give them a little try if you're able to identify this plant out in the woods. Next up, we have our Vacciniums. And we love our Vacciniums because these are lots of really, really delicious berries. We've got our huckleberries, our blueberries. Other Vacciniums include our cranberries, although we don't really talk about any cranberries in this course. Now, we've kind of been building up to the Vacciniums because some of these things, they can actually be really hard to tell apart when you're out in the field. And yeah, you have to look at some really subtle differences, especially between the leaves of these plants. But we're brave. We've been working on our plant ID all up to this point, and we will persevere, team. Okay, so first of all, telling apart some of your Vacciniums. This book, Plants of Coastal British Columbia, it's got this great little guide which really focuses you on some of the features and how to distinguish between each of them. So you have this book. I'd strongly recommend taking a look at this little guide that they include in there. But I'll also try and pull out some of the key points from that. First of all, red huckleberry, Vaccinium parvifolium. So red huckleberry, parvifolium, remember, let's break apart this name a little bit. We said before, parva means small. Folium refers to the leaves. So this is basically your small-leafed Vaccinium. And that's a really fitting name because this thing just has really teeny tiny little leaves. Its leaves are going to be like the size of the end of your pinky or the size of the end of one of your other fingers perhaps, but just really teeny tiny little leaves. As well, this one will often have, you see this one in lots of lowland forests around Vancouver, around southwestern British Columbia. And it'll also often have these really green new stems, and so it's a much greener looking plant if you just look at the bush than a lot of the other vacciniums that we look at. You also often see this one growing up on nurse logs and on things like that. Pretty common for it to be trying to grow as like a little epiphyte kind of above the forest floor. All right, so a few key things to note about this. This is going to be the easiest one of our vacciniums to distinguish when you have the fruit, because it produces these really teeny tiny little red berries. They're pretty good to eat. They're a good little snack if you find them out in the forest. They're not so much really sweet. They tend to be more tart, but definitely give them a shot. And then you can get a closer look at these leaves here, and they tend to be kind of this little oval shape. There's these really teeny tiny little oval leaves. Another photo, so we can see some of those flowers here. Yeah, the flowers kind of yellowish pinkish, and they're this little bell shape. In general, a lot of the flowers for the vacciniums look really similar, and so those aren't a great way to tell this plant apart. But look for those what you want to look for. You're going to want to look for those red berries when they're in season, and you're going to want to look for those really teeny tiny little oval leaves. Okay. Next up, our black huckleberry, Vaccinium membranaceum. So this is, of all of the fruiting plants that we've talked about in this course, this one is probably the most significant from an economic perspective. Black huckleberry is actually cultivated, especially in more like inland regions of the Pacific Northwest. I used to go down to Idaho a lot when I was a kid, and we'd always get this black huckleberry ice cream when we were there. So delicious. And this is one of the best tasting plants in the course, so you really want to know how to identify this one. And one of the reasons why it is it's a really delicious plant, and it produces really high volumes of berries. And it's said that in some places that have lots of black huckleberry, when the fruits are in season, they'll actually turn like hillsides purple. So that's why it's such a significant plant from an economic perspective. Around here, you can find this one if you go hiking a little bit higher up in the mountains. And so the red huckleberry, a little bit more of a lowland plant. Black huckleberry, you get some elevation, and you can start to find this. So looking at a few key features, the big thing that we want to use to identify the black huckleberry, the biggest thing of all, are the leaves. So it's got these leaves that we call lanceolate, and that means they look kind of like the head of a spear. Compared to the other berries the other vacciniums that we look at, they're much pointier and more elongated. And another key thing to note is around the margins, around the edges of these leaves, it's really distinctly serrate. It's got these real distinct teeth going around the edges there. That is the key feature to look at for this species. As far as the reproductive structures go, once again, you've got kind of those little nondescript bell-shaped flowers, and then you've got these beautiful kind of purple to blue colored berries, kind of shiny, kind of, like shiny or glabrous looking. Really, really delicious. Key thing to look at though, little lanceolate leaves, maybe about the size of, max out the size of your thumb, serrated around the edges. Okay, next up, Alaskan blueberry, Vaccinium alaskaense. Don't you love it when the scientific name is just exactly the same as the common name? Alaskan blueberry, Vaccinium alaskaense. Perfect. This is another one that, you find this one in a lot of sites that are sort of similar to the black huckleberry that we just looked at. Around BC, you often find this one a little bit higher up in the mountains. So that's a good spot to look for it if you're going hiking around Vancouver. Okay, now the key feature to identify your Alaskan blueberry is the midvein of these little leaves, and it's got these little hairs on the middle there. That is the key thing. The leaves in general, they don't look like, they're not as serrated. They don't have the same serrations that the black huckleberry has. Some of them, like the book says that they might be serrated a little bit. In practice, you look at it in the field, it's not really serrated at all. The key thing to look at, though, is these whiskers on the midvein underneath. And sometimes these can be really hard to see, but look out for them. Okay, looking at the flowers, looking at the fruit, once again, the fruit are kind of these purple to blue, sort of shiny looking berries, quite delicious. I don't think they're not quite as sweet as the black huckleberry. The black huckleberries are really like, yes, but these are still really good. The flowers, you get the flowers, once again, aren't a great way to identify these. The book will list, you can look at the different proportions of the flowers to try and differentiate the species. In practice, really just look at the leaves to try and differentiate. You can see they've got kind of these more oval-shaped leaves than the black huckleberry. You can't really see any noticeable serrations around the margins. So the leaves the whiskers, they're kind of oval-shaped. That's what you're looking for. And finally, we have our oval-leaved blueberry, Vaccinium ovalifolium. It kind of sounds like a made-up scientific name, doesn't it? Ovalifolium literally translates to oval-leaved. It doesn't even sound real though, but easy to remember because of that. This one is so similar to the Alaskan blueberry that we just looked at that some authorities, I don't know if they still do, but at least at one point in time, they categorized this one as being the same species. So very, very subtle differences with this, but we'll get right into that. First of all, the leaves. Alaskan blueberry, whiskery underneath. Oval-leaved blueberry, no whiskers. This is a clean-shaved blueberry. So that's the key thing to keep in mind. This one doesn't have the whiskers on the undersides of the leaves. Other than that, you're not you look at the leaf in general, it's kind of this oval shape, and then it has no serrations around the outside. So that's how you're going to tell it apart from the black huckleberry that we just looked at. Remember, the black huckleberry is serrated around the margins, and more of like a pointier lanceolate shape. As far as the flowers go, flowers, once again, hard to use to distinguish between the different plants with the flowers there. I think they say that this one is, it's going to be longer or taller than it is fat versus the Alaskan blueberry, which is the opposite way around. But if you want to bring your ruler out and measure these flowers that are like the size of your pinky tip, then go for it. But look at the leaves. That's going to be the thing that's going to really distinguish these for you. And the fruits, last of all. So this is one that you could actually potentially use to distinguish this plant. So the black huckleberry, the Alaskan blueberry, both of those have kind of these shiny colored, really glabrous berries. That's the botanical word for shiny, basically. When we look at the oval-leaf blueberry, it has something called a bloom on the fruit. And that's basically like this little powdery coating. And so it's not nearly as shiny. If you wanted to get technical and botanical, you could call it a little bit more glaucous. And so, that bloom is something that you could potentially use to differentiate it, but the leaves are really the key thing there. Okay, so I have given you this wonderful gift, which is the synthesis of huckleberry and blueberry state of knowledge for Forestry 201. And so, you can review this to try and really differentiate between these different species, because these can be quite hard to tell apart. And that is all for this group. Thanks for tuning in. Go to Patrick Culbert's site, quiz yourself, and come to lab and we'll do some review. See you next time.